Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to week 12 of Politics, Power and Resistance. Let me begin by acknowledging that I'm joining you today from the unceded lands of the Gadigal-Wongal people. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present and remind everybody that wherever you are on this continent, this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So today I'm more than delighted to welcome Kian Aspinall to the stage of Politics, Power and Resistance. And I've asked Kian to join us to talk to us a little bit about fascism. And the reason for this is that it is Kian's field of expertise. I'm delighted to tell everybody that Kian is actually my PhD student. He has written an excellent and extremely interesting and illuminating thesis on the connection between fascism and the Black radical tradition and racial capitalism. And he's currently a research associate in the Department of Sociology at the University of Cambridge. So welcome, Kian. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very
Okay,
much.
so we have a few questions, or at least I have written down a few questions that I'd like you to address for our students so that they can get to know why it's important to know something both about the history of fascism and also the question of whether or not we think fascism might be coming back or might be a feature of current political life. So a number of questions, as I said, we'll take them one by one. And let's start with a general and more historical question. And that is, could you please give us a brief overview of the history of European fascism?
Of course. Thank you again for having me. A brief historical overview of fascism would really have to start in 1919. And it is in 1919 that you get the two parties that we associate with fascism, the Italian black shirts and the Nazis in Germany. They both form off the back of World War One. And the Nazis are originally called the German Workers' Party. And in Italy, you have Mussolini's Fasci di Combattimento. And the next 10 years of both of their histories are essentially climbs to power. The 1920s are in Italy, filled with Mussolini and his black shirts battling with anti-fascists in the streets, trying to form a government, which they end up doing in 1922. The Nazi Party perhaps could be said to have a more stuttering start. Really, what catapults them into power is the economic crash of 1929, by which point there is a nationalist fervor in Germany that they are riding on. And in 1933, Hitler becomes chancellor. And I think it's quite important to hold these two cases in parallel because they are in communication with one another throughout the 1920s and 1930s. In 1935, you have the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, which is seen as a completion of Italian unification. And for Germany, they spend much of the 1930s industrializing and really preparing their war economy. And of course, as we all know, in 1939, Germany invades Poland. That triggers Poland's alliance with France and Britain, and therefore we have the outbreak of war, into which fascist Italy is dragged, kicking and screaming. I think if your students want to read any of the military history around this, they will see that Italy's military was quite far behind Germany, France, and Britain. But nonetheless, by that time, they had formed a formal alliance with Germany. And so you have the outbreak of World War II, which of course ends in 1945. They are some very, very brief but important dates. World War One, lasting from 1914 to 1918, has a huge impact on Europe. And it is off the back of that that I think in 1919 you have the Nazi Party form in Germany and the black shirts form in Italy.
Mm. So, I mean, you've talked about the Italian case and the German case, and indeed, we often talk about these things together, and we often
Mhm.
refer to both as fascism in very broad terms. But you've already intimated that these are quite different, although allied for particular political and military reasons. So, I think this is a good time to delve a little bit further into what you think might be the crucial differences between Italian fascism and German Nazism.
Yeah, so this is a question that has been the subject of quite heated debate
Hmm.
amongst historians and sociologists and political scientists. So the general consensus is that Nazism is a type of fascism. If we think of fascism as an umbrella term, within that you have different types of fascism, and Nazism is one type. Um, it is a very extreme version of fascism. And of course, what hangs over the history of this period is the history of the Holocaust, which was
Hmm.
pioneered, of course, by the German Nazis. And I think a key difference is the centering of a biological conception of race that was absolutely critical to Nazi philosophy.
Mm.
And that isn't to say, importantly, that the Italian fascists were not racial. They certainly were, and they certainly had a lot of time for biological, scientific racism. There were a couple of problems for the Italians in that regard. One is that with the racial hierarchies internal to Europe, the Italians were often considered to be lower
Mm.
in that racial hierarchy than their Nordic or Anglo-Saxon cousins. And so they were somewhat reluctant to engage in scientific racism. Their racism was of a more cultural and spiritual nature in that they
Mm.
saw the history of Italy, and that could be drawn back to ancient Rome, as uniting the Italian ethnic peoples as they were in the 20th century. Um, it is important, of course, to say that whenever you look at this stuff, it is filled with contradictions. And you will find instances of Italian racial scientists engaging in race science in a way that the Germans did. And you will find Germans, such as Heinrich Himmler, looking for a spiritual connection in history. Um, but broadly speaking, I think a key difference is how they understood race and racism. And in terms of how their history actually unfolded, there are some key differences. I mentioned before the differences in military might between the two
Mm.
countries. And that is partly to do with the development of industry before World War One and World War Two, in that Germany was a much more industrialized nation, even at the beginning of World War One in 1914 than Italy. And at the end of World War One, it had a much more accomplished military. It had a much more stable bureaucracy. The Weimar Republic could be said to be a ambitious but much more stable political system than the Italian system, which was a mix of kingship with the King Emmanuel and a parliament. And I think Italy was divided between the north and the south, in that the
Mm.
north, Milan, Bologna, Florence, Genoa, Pisa, these were industrial hubs.
Mm.
Factories were quite common there. In the
Mm.
south and in Sicily, it was very rural. Um, and this creates a lots of internal problems within Italy. Whereas Germany, of course, it had rural areas, it had industrial areas, but its industrial advancement was much further along the line, shall we say, uh,
Mm.
than their Italian neighbors. And this, I think, um, matters when you are comparing how the two histories unfolded in the 1930s. Um,
Mm.
just as a further example, when Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, um, they successfully occupied the capital, Addis Ababa, but it was extremely difficult for them. And they were the laughingstock in many ways of other Western imperial nations
Mm.
um, for struggling to do this. And it was a bit of an embarrassment for the Italians. And that is partly to do with the economic and industrial development of Italy at the time. They were, in the words of the great historian of fascism, who was actually Australian, R.J.B. Bosworth, they
Mm.
were the sick man of Europe. They were a third-rate imperial power. And so much of their fascist project was catching up with everyone else. Much of the Nazi fascist project was realizing a preordained destiny as a first-rate industrial imperial power within Europe.
I mean, that's interesting and kind of going off script a little bit because it seems that some of the things that you've spoken about are in place in other countries in Europe at the time. So, for example, advanced race science, its integration into politics going back to the 19th century, both in Britain and France. And you find this on the right wing and the left wing of politics. Much more advanced colonialism and imperialism
Mm-hmm.
um, in these other nation states. And of course, I think we need to think about, the kind of the European space, these different nation states competing with each other, not just internally to Europe, but also in terms of their colonial ambitions. So you mentioned Ethiopia. I'm just going to add this in here because I think, just to the students, things we spent quite a lot of time talking about colonialism, particularly in the Australian context, but also thinking about it more broadly and what it means to what does coloniality mean. So we're familiar with these terms. So I'm just wondering to what extent you think that Italy's colonial ambitions specifically had a link to its fascist kind of context, let's say, from the 1920s onwards.
Absolutely. So it's important, I think, to note that in the prior century, in the 19th century, from 1861 to about 1871, Italy had gone through unification.
Mm-hmm.
And this was something called the Risorgimento. And part of that was realizing Italy as a European nation.
Mm-hmm.
And a consequence of that is that many Italian politicians, many Italian citizens and generals believed that having colonies was what being European entailed. Of course, when you fast forward from then to the 1920s, the British Empire is the largest empire in the world,
Mm.
followed closely by France, of course, Spain, Portugal, Germany, before World War One, had many colonies. And so when Italy invade Ethiopia, they are motivated in quite large part by the prospect of taking their place in the sun, as they said, by
Mm.
taking their place as an imperial power amongst other European nations. Fascism, as a specifically nationalist project from its inception in 1919, understood itself in large part to be the completion of Italian unification. And in that sense, the completion of Italian colonial ambitions.
Mm.
Um, there's a PDF online. I think it was I think it's Mussolini's autobiography in 1928, where he's kind of looking back upon the last 9 years of fascism in Italy. And he says in there, from the beginning, we knew that we had to take our place in the sun. This was part of the project.
Mm.
And so the link between Italian colonialism and Italian fascism is not so much a link, an extension of the same project. They're
Right.
one of the same phenomena, really. Um, and it was much the same for Nazi Germany. Um, there are quite simply geographic differences in where they could go and what they could do. Um,
Yeah.
the other major power in North Africa, of course, at the time was Britain. um, and France. And so the Italians struggled for a while to find a country that they could invade without annoying these much greater powers. Um, Eventually, they settled on Ethiopia, partly because France and Britain allowed them to. Um,
Mm.
so I hope that that is
Yeah.
a cogent answer.
Yeah, no, that adds a lot. So let's move on from this question, which is very interesting, but we could probably spend all night talking about it. And we will return to those themes a little bit later on. But one of the things that's very important to understand about fascism is also the link to capitalism, because for a lot of analysts of fascism, unless you have capitalism, you don't have fascism. So this is something that
Mhm.
these two things are interlinked with each other, and that to a certain extent, capitalists use fascists and vice versa in order to advance their projects. For some people, fascism is kind of the epitome, or let's say the end point of capitalism. So we need to understand, fascism is an outgrowth of capitalism. So
Mhm.
how would you elaborate on this question?
Yeah, so I think there are two dimensions to this. I think one dimension is talking about capitalists as agents of an economic system and
Mm,
how they individually or as specific organizations or companies or businesses interacted with um, fascists on a more personal scale. So how
mm,
did, say, Volkswagen in Germany interact with the Nazis once they were in power? And the answer to that question is actually one of the few consensuses within the scholarship on this, in that businesses helped fascists.
mm,
Um, it's not to say that they were always in accord about everything, but there was a tacit agreement in both Germany and Italy that if businesses and capitalists were allowed to continue to produce,
mhm,
continue to employ, and continue to profit, even if what they were producing, instead of going to a mass market, was commandeered by the state, if they were allowed to do that, then they were happy to work with fascist governments.
mm,
Um, And that can be found in the work of very, very mainstream historians of fascism, such as Bosworth, who I mentioned before. Richard J. Evans is another one, who wrote a book called The Third Reich in Power, in which he
mhm,
has whole chapters about the interactions between businesses. And the vast majority of historians agree that on an individual level, there was a very effective working relationship. And
mm,
of course, if you look at somewhere like Germany, which throughout the 1930s had extensive industrial plans and an extensive bureaucracy, this could only be accomplished with an effective working relationship with business and capitalists. So
yeah,
that's the first dimension.
yeah,
The second dimension shifts the understanding of what capitalism is, where instead of looking at capitalism being the doings of capitalists, we look at capitalism as a total social system. That
mhm,
is an entire apparatus of a society, how that society is organized, and what types of relations people have in that society. And in that sense, we of course have to take a step back and say, well, fascism was only produced in capitalist societies.
yeah,
That's an important point to recognize. And within that, they were produced in liberal democracies, which raises further questions. Um, but in that sense, you have to look at, and Hitler and Mussolini, the two famous dictators of the fascist century, are great insights into this. How did they approach the key tenets of capitalism as a total social system? Did they question private property? Did
mm,
they question profit? Did they question the existence of business or the alienation from workers of their labor? Did they question any of these things, which are
mm,
absolutely fundamental to capitalism as an economic, political, and social system? No, they didn't. In
mm,
fact, both of them actively supported it. And you can
Right.
find this in the writings of Hitler in Mein Kampf, and you can find it in Mussolini's various writings in his autobiography. And again, this is something that historians of these two figures wholeheartedly agree on. Um, in fact, in Ian Kershaw's two-volume biography of Hitler, he says that Hitler never questioned the existence of private property, never
Mm.
questioned the accumulation of wealth off the back of workers' labor. And so I think from this perspective, you have to say that fascism was spawned in capitalist society, and it is very much the product of capitalist parents. Um, of course, you you also have to acknowledge that I think the war economy of Nazi Germany, which historians have said is characteristic of Nazi Germany, and this might move us on to another topic down the line. The war economy of Germany is fundamentally capitalist,
Mm.
which raises interesting questions about today when we look at an economy like the United States,
Mm.
which has a bigger budget given to their military than the next seven, eight, nine countries combined.
Yes.
Uh, are they not also a war economy? But I think the fundamental answer to your question is they were very, very much in tune with the logics of capitalism,
Mm.
very reluctant to challenge it. Um, if they did challenge it, it was to centralize the production of industry for the interests of the state and nation. Um, and you have that centralization of um, industry that produces things like guns, bullets, bombs, planes, things that would be
Mm.
useful to a war economy, but also quite fundamental resources like oil, timber, tin, steel. These were all commandeered by the state, but they allowed the profits to still go to shareholders and individuals.
Yes, of course, and which is what assured the ongoing alliance between the capitalist class, who you mentioned at the beginning, and the fascist state. I mean, I think this is a really important point to make because so often in popular discourse, you get this very facile thing being repeated, but the Nazis were the National Socialists, so weren't they actually socialists? So I think it's, obviously from a historian's perspective, that's quite ridiculous. But because a lot of us, will have heard this kind of thing being said online or in other spaces, then I think it's really important to make that point so we're absolutely
Mhm.
clear. But this does lead me on to another question. And we were reading an article for class by Daniel Trilling,
Mm,
and he quotes from the German Marxist theorist and communist activist Clara Zetkin, who said
mm.
that fascism was popular among, and I quote, the politically homeless, the socially uprooted, the destitute, and the disillusioned. So this seems to be a little bit paradoxical when you think about the alignment that we've just spoken about between fascism and capitalism, because as we know from our learning, the capitalist class obviously exploits the lower classes and the working classes. So it seems a little bit odd that these classes, so the destitute, would turn to fascism when fascism was in such alignment with capitalism. So do you think that Clara Zetkin is right? Um, is her quote correct, or is there something else going on?
I think I think there are different motivations for different people to align themselves with a fascist movement.
Hmm.
I think for many capitalists and many businesses, um, there was a tacit agreement that, on the one hand, fascism would continue to allow them to produce what they had to produce to make money if they produced those things for a fascist government. And on the other hand, for the capitalist class, fascism was very much a bulwark against communism.
Hmm.
And fascism, of course, went on to destroy in across Europe the kind of communist parties and anti-fascist resistance that had built up in the 1920s and 30s. So I think that's important to know. Um, as for Zetkin's proposition, I think following World War One, there were many destitute veterans. There were
Mm.
many people who came back after fighting in the First World War who had witnessed a collapse of European society.
Mm.
And many of them came back, as many of them do now, and there was very little support for them. There was unemployment, poverty, and it was very difficult for them to reintegrate into society. Now, I think Zetkin is at somewhat at odds with much of the scholarship on the social backgrounds to many people who joined fascist movements, in that people like Alexander de Grand, the Italian historian
Mm.
of fascism, proposed that fascism was a movement of the middle classes. Uh,
Mm.
Now, in my view, I think it's very difficult to pin the roots of a fascist movement on one class. I
Yeah.
think that you end up um, you end up finding roots of fascism in every class. And then, therefore, I think it's important to be attuned to the different reasons. Many of the working class people that joined fascism were essentially caught up in nationalist fervor,
Mm.
in the idea that there was a period of decline. Um, so much so that the British historian has called this period the morbid age. Um,
Mm.
There was a period of decline. You have in 1929 the economic crash. In Germany, they had been stripped of their colonies. They had huge inflation. Their political system was very, by that point, unstable, and the Nazi Party had risen to the fore. And so there was a sense of humiliation. There was a sense of
Mm.
social, political, and economic breakdown. And so you have many working class people, I think, join up to the movement as a project of rectification, as a
Mm.
project of kind of ultra nationalist regeneration. Um,
Right.
for the middle classes, I think there is that, but there is also the kind of clearer economic prospects. These were, many of them were small business owners, and they wanted the opportunity to continue that. But with inflation, this was very difficult. And then, of
Mm.
course, in the upper classes and the capitalist class, they are looking at ways to stop communist organization and for a way to basically continue making money. And
Mm.
so I think Zetkin is correct in that you have many destitute workers join fascist movements. Um, but I think the reasons that different classes and social backgrounds join these movements are quite varied, um,
Mm.
which of course we see today. And of course, there are different reasons in different national contexts. I think that's
Yeah.
important to know. In Italy, um, interestingly, the word fascism was originally used to just mean or fasci, as they say in Italian, was just to mean to use a bundle of people with a singular purpose.
Yeah.
Um, and therefore it was used from everyone from Sicilian peasants who were forming a trade union to Mussolini's fascist movement.
Right.
Um, and so many workers in Italy join it because they want that singular purpose, that singular
Mm.
motivation that, of course, snowballed into the history that we now recognize. But at the
Mm.
point of joining, if we take a kind of imminent approach to this, of course, what they're seeing in 1919, 1920, 1921 is very different to how we see it with the benefit of hindsight.
Yeah.
And so, in their historical context, they're witnessing a feeling of decline and societal breakdown. And so,
Mm.
for many of them, it was a project of regeneration that spread across different classes.
Mm. Yeah, that's very interesting. Also, thinking, as we will a little bit later on, what kind of aspirations people who follow along with fascist or proto-fascist parties that are around today, what they think the benefits will be to them, even when we can see from an external perspective that these parties don't actually have social regeneration, um, as their primary concern. And particularly when we think about the link to capitalists and capitalism, then we can think about how deluded a lot of these supporters are. But we'll
Mm,
get onto that in a minute. Before we get there, I want to turn to this very big debate that exists in the discussion of fascism out there in the world among people who are observing both history and also current events. And this is the question of whether we should really be very strict about when we date fascism and where we place it. So for people on one side of the debate, they'll say, really, we're only talking about what you've spoken about until now, which is European fascism in Italy and Germany in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, and that's it. And we really shouldn't extrapolate from that or talk about it in any other time and place.
mhm,
But there's another side to that debate. And people on the other side say that really fascism is an inherent feature of unjust, oppressive societies. This is a quote again from Daniel Trilling's article. For
mm,
example, we could say that Australia, as a settler colony, which is founded on Indigenous dispossession and genocide, has some of the features of fascism, especially obviously with regards to the ongoing subjugation of Indigenous people. So, could you tell us a little bit more about this debate and maybe also tell us what side of it you might be on, or maybe you're not on any side?
Yeah, so this is a debate that has been a defining feature of the literature on fascism. And when I say that, I'm thinking of a highly controversial but yet highly influential article that was published in 1979 by a historian called Gilbert Allardyce. And he argued that if you extrapolate fascism from its interwar context and apply it to other things, you are deflating the concept itself. It becomes
Mm-hmm.
meaningless. And so I think this debate is really reflective of a conversation that has gone on for several decades. Now, as to where I fall on it, I very much believe that fascism is not locked into the interwar period, nor is it locked into the national contexts of Italy and Germany. And I think a good way to approach that specific point is to recognize that fascism was certainly not isolated to those countries in the interwar period itself.
Mm.
Um, Britain, Romania, Austria, Norway, Finland, Spain, Portugal, many, many more countries besides, and many countries outside of Europe, Australia itself, Canada, New Zealand, the US, Brazil, all of these countries had fascist movements to varying sizes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as soon as you acknowledge that, you have to essentially say, okay, if fascism isn't locked into Germany and Italy between the years 1919 and 1945, why is it temporally locked into the interwar period itself?
Mm.
You then have to acknowledge that many fascist movements appeared after 1945. Um, you mentioned Australia and the presence of fascism there, and I think this goes back to the question you raised about Italian colonialism and fascism, wherein if you read Black radicals from the 1930s and 1940s, people like W.E.B. Du Bois, C.L.R. James, or George Padmore, these were people that had witnessed colonialism, whether it's in the US or in Trinidad, where C.L.R. James and
Mm.
George Padmore were from.
Mm-hmm.
And they're witnessing the rise of German and Italian fascism. And they say, we've been suffering this our entire lives through racial and authoritarian governance in the colonies.
Yeah.
And I think that not so much as deflates the term, but in fact reorients what we mean by fascism itself.
Mm.
A lot of historians like to explain fascism by pointing to the events that constitute its history. And I
Mm.
think this is quite a poor way of explaining what fascism is. I think you have to look at fascism as a way of organizing human beings and as a
Mm.
social process. And if you do that, and if you take into account the work and anti fascist analyses of people that have lived in colonial societies and how they have perceived European fascism, they see no distinction. Um,
mm,
the fascism debate as it exists now, which has been particularly centered in the US and about whether Donald Trump is fascist or not,
yeah.
I think is partly a product of um, quite a liberal and Democrat led, in terms of Democrat, the party led
Hmm.
to delegitimize Trump in that way. But if you actually dig down into many of their conceptions of what fascism actually is, it's very fuzzy.
Yeah.
Um, and I also don't think it's particularly helpful to center on individuals like Donald Trump, however
Mm,
grotesque he may
yeah.
be. If you're diagnosing a social problem, I don't think you can do that with an analysis of one individual.
Yeah.
Um, and I think you then have to say, well, if we look at what the US has been, being a settler colony, being an empire, having a war economy, particularly at the moment, having feelings of economic breakdown, and that the solution to that is a distinct and hyper racial nationalism. Um, I think you then have to say, well, it fits many of the hallmark definitions of interwar fascism. And the only distinction that people seem to have is that, well, it's in a different time and place. And for my part, I don't think that's a good enough reason to say that it
Mm,
isn't. Um, and just to tack onto that a bit more scholarship, um, the work of Gerald Horne, the Black radical American historian, I think is of great importance here. If any of your students want to look this up, he has written extensively about settler colonialism and racism in the US.
mm,
Um, and he makes the point that if you adopt contemporary understandings of what fascism actually is, and you look at then the US, you could argue that the US has been fascist from its inception
yeah.
as a colony. And I think from that, you open up the debate to places like Australia or New Zealand or
Mm.
Canada, or even the British Empire itself and its violent doings in Africa.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. I think what you've given us is a conception of fascism, which is much more about systems and ideologies than it is about personalities and leaders. Although, of course,
Mm-hmm.
so much of the study of fascism and also the popular interpretation of fascism has been very much bound up with the cult of personality. And that's why this fixation on, is Donald Trump fascist rather than is the United States fascist, which I think is a much more interesting question that certainly when you're led by people who write in the Black radical tradition, and also ordinary Black, Indigenous, and colonized people who've experienced authoritarian and oppressive and degrading and genocidal rule. Will, speaking from that lived experience, will have a very different conception of what that actually means in the day to day, and actually who's sitting in the White House is of less importance than
Mm-hmm.
what acts of oppression they're undergoing. So I think this is a really, really um, important analysis. And I mean, I was also thinking when you were speaking that I wonder, and from my own work, I think I would probably, answer in the affirmative myself, that a big reason why there's so much focus on confining the period of fascism to the interwar, well, to the period of the middle of the 20th century is in Europe is because of the exceptionalism of that's attached to the Nazi genocide and the Holocaust of the Jews, and how that is kind of set apart from other genocidal projects that occurred before and since
Mm-hmm.
in the colonial context. And one of the important people, just to note here briefly, is Aimé Césaire, the Martinican leader and political thinker, who spoke about the boomerang effect. So this idea of what happened in the colonies to Black and colonized people coming back to bite, as it were, Europeans, and Europeans only really caring about genocide when it happened to people on quote unquote their own soil. So I think all of this kind of speaks to this question of what do we really mean when we speak about fascism, and why do we gatekeep the term? Like, what are the political reasons for gatekeeping the term and confining it to particular historical periods and geographical locations?
Mm-hmm.
Um, Okay, so I've got a final question because you are currently in Britain and the right wing Reform Party. So it's a new political party made up of a kind of an older configuration. So the same leader who was leading another right wing party before Nigel Farage leads this party. And there's
Mhm.
just been local elections just in the previous week before we're speaking. So we're talking about May, beginning of May, first half of May 2026. And this party has done very well in the local elections. And it has led some people to say that if, I guess, things don't change radically, that this party could actually make up the next government in Britain in the next general election. So I'm just wondering what your take is on what happened and whether you think that risk is, you know, logical.
Yeah, well, I have to start this by saying that it is that diagnosing contemporary events that are happening around us, as you well know, is in many ways much harder than doing historical work. The
Mm,
challenges are very different, and when you turn to the present, things are unraveling very, very quickly. So I'll start with that caveat. But at
mm,
this second, I think that the prospect of a reform government is quite a likely event. I think what generally happens in general elections is that the closer you get to them, the more parties rein in some of their more extreme policies.
mm,
There's a kind of well-worn saying in British politics that elections are won in the centre. Um,
mm,
and what that I think refers to is not necessarily the orientation of the parties, but is really who can attract the most mass support. And I
mm,
think Britain is feeling a profound sense of decline at the
mm,
moment, and a profound sense that politics really is not an adequate avenue for change.
mm.
Um, that is partly to do with immense levels of inequality, record
Yes.
levels of inequality. Um, Things like bills getting higher, the way that people are living their everyday lives, they're waking up in the morning and wondering,
Mm,
how can I put dinner on the table? And I think this contributes to a profound malaise
mm,
in the general population. And I think that will likely lead to a reform government. Um,
mm,
Now, reform themselves are essentially campaigning on a racist anti-immigration ticket. Um,
mm,
that is their number one policy. And the reasons for that working and for appealing to people are very interesting. Um, I think nationalism, to quote one of our favorite scholars, Cedric Robinson, is the most important ideology of our times.
mm.
Um, and specifically, that is racial nationalism.
Yeah.
The idea that there is in Britain, a white nation that belongs in Britain um, is extremely prevalent. And the idea that there are others that come from
Mm,
elsewhere, particularly non-white immigrants,
yeah.
is a necessary part of that feeling. You can't have racial nationalism in the way we have without the extension of racism to these kind of non-white communities,
Mm,
imagined or otherwise. Um, they work in tandem, and I think reform is pioneering that. Um, the groundwork of this has been laid, it must be said, by the British Labour Party.
mm,
The British Labour Party was elected with a huge majority a couple of years ago. Keir Starmer, of course, leading the party and becoming Prime Minister.
mm,
And as soon as they got into power, they made an effort to command people who felt that prohibiting immigration, to having hard borders, the Labour Party said, well, we need their support. And so
mm,
what they did is for a time pioneered the anti-immigrationist rhetoric that reform is using now.
mm,
Um, And with the benefit of hindsight, you can look at that and say, well, if Labour had not done that, if they had tried to delegitimize that argument and look elsewhere for popular support, would reform be where they are now?
mm,
And I think the answer is likely no.
mm,
But Labour legitimised anti-immigration as a reasonable political stance, which hasn't worked for them
yeah,
because reform are now steaming up behind them and
mm,
look like they're going to form the next government. And so the reasons I think are twofold. On the one hand, you have a party in power, that is the Labour Party, with a huge majority, which has done, it seems, everything in their power to legitimise the politics that reform have
yeah,
by hardening borders, increasing police presences, cracking down on pro-Palestine protests, of course, um, and forwarding this, stop the boats, anti-immigrationist rhetoric.
mm,
And on the other hand, they have done absolutely nothing to combat inequality, to
mm,
combat unemployment, to combat the feeling of decline that is
mm,
very prevalent in the UK. And reform have come in and they just intensify this and offer more extreme solutions. One of them
mm,
recently being that they are going to set up detention centres for illegal migrants in green voting constituencies, which is actually illegal because you
mm,
cannot threaten voters.
right,
But everyone seems to have forgotten this. Um,
mm,
and so reform will just take this legitimized territory and intensify it. And, you know, we have a media economy in this country which seems intent on also justifying this type of politics.
mm,
And when you take these three things together, the average person is looking at the political parties, I think, and going, well, we need a way to restore Britain. We
mm,
need to regenerate the country. And they are being told every day that nationalist anxieties and racism are legitimate politics.
yeah,
Um, and so that's the way they end up being politically inclined. Um, it's a sad state of affairs,
yeah,
to be
indeed.
honest.
Indeed, and it's interesting to think about it in reflecting from our position here in Australia. I mean, it's quite a good warning to the Australian Labor Party that's done quite similar things to what the British Labour Party has done, building on a very long history of the Australian Labour Party, having pioneered not only detention centres for asylum seekers, that the idea of which has been exported around the world, but also, of course, the white nationalism that the Australian Federation was founded on, which is very much a Labour-driven policy. So I'm talking about the White Australia policy, which is at the bedrock of Australian citizenship, albeit it was reformed in the 1970s, but there's still very much a racial hierarchy, um, which kind of we can see in the current immigration system, that although there's a much bigger diversity in terms of who can migrate to Australia, there's still kind of an expectation to assimilate into a particular white way of doing things, which as migrants to Australia, you have to kind of agree to sign up to, in order to shore up the power of the Australian capitalist state against the Indigenous owners of the land, as it were. So it's quite interesting because One Nation has also had some small electoral success just recently on the last weekend. And of course, as you said rightly, I mean, we can't really tell the future, but there are definitely similar patterns, because at the same time that the Australian Labor Party is going very hard, and becoming very authoritarian, particularly when it comes to freedom to protest and freedom of speech, it isn't doing much for people in terms of redressing inequality, because the cost of living crisis is being felt very hard by ordinary people here. And at the
Mm.
same time, just as you said, in relation to Germany historically and to the US in an ongoing sense, a huge amount of our taxpayer money goes to armaments and thinking about submarines and
Mm.
other forms of weaponry that we certainly, as the citizens, don't see any benefit from. While at the same time, there are obvious cuts to all of the public services that we rely on. So these are all things to bear in mind when we think about these more historical examples and examples from Britain and thinking about our reality here and how we can, translate this into our the kinds of things that we face as ordinary people, I guess. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.